Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today, you've got Mr. Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad, and we're talking about OpenSSH. And so, those of you who are kind of, keeping an eye on what's going on in the world of vulnerabilities and exploits, et cetera, will probably have heard about this. And so today we're going to do something a little different, right? We're going to deep dive into the details of this vulnerability, how it works, why it works, and and really kind of understand what its impact may be to the general just security of the internet, man. Like it's pretty serious. So
Yep. And this kind of broke right before 4th of July, right? And fortunately, it wasn't one of those flurry storms like Log4j or a SolarWinds or anything.
Yeah.
So I think most people probably got to enjoy their 4th of July holiday because it was kind of a mundane like thing, and the exploitation is maybe kind of difficult, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But kind of an interesting timing point is like these things always happen around holidays. Like
Always,
you just almost put a bet on it within a week or two of a major holiday, especially Western holidays.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like they hold on to it until the timing's just right, just to punish IT people, I guess. I don't know why. Yeah. So there's really kind of two CVEs here, right? There's 2024 6387, which we're gonna really kind of focus on in this conversation, but there's also 6409, which is relatively newer, but it's a really similar thing, and a lot of the things we're going to talk about today apply directly to that as well. It's just a variation of what we're already talking about. So basically, let's talk at a high level what OpenSSH is, or SSHD. And so it is an open source project. It implements a service or daemon in a Linux environment. It'll also, there are variations for Windows, obviously, too. But it implements a SSH as a protocol, which is a client-server architecture, leveraging an encrypted communication to handle authentication, file movements, remote commands, things of that nature, right? So it's kind of a more secure version of like maybe a telnet or an FTP combined, if that makes sense. And so, at a high level, this is super common on the internet, right? Like we see this on every other external penetration test that we do. How many did you say? You said you had a number of like how many instances there are out there, right?
Yeah, I found a post on Twitter that said there was about 98.3 million results found on fofa.info in nearly a year, just searching for OpenSSH.
Target-rich environment, man. Yeah, that's a lot. Now, not all instances of the service are vulnerable. So if it's running on BSD, supposedly that's not vulnerable, although I've kind of seen some mixed results on that. And so, and actually that's a good opportunity to say this. This is very much a developing story. And so this kind of broke from Qualys, and they, even in their initial release, which was on the 1st, even in that, they're like, hey, we're still researching this thing. There are likely going to be more details to come. So we're going to put links in the show notes. And so I encourage you guys to go out and do research on your own and understand things. But what is the actual vulnerability? Like, how does it work? Like, what's your interpretation of how this thing goes down?
Yeah, so my my understanding, right, is it's essentially kind of a denial of service condition, and I think you were going to point out as well that the timing on this is interesting, right? Because like with denial of service or like buffer overflows, stuff like that, you have an approximate time window to exploit that thing. It's usually very small. Like it's a small window. Like you try and overflow a buffer and then you do it, like it's seconds, or maybe minutes or something, depending on delay, network speed and stuff like that. But this takes multiple days potentially to actually get to a point where it's actually going to be exploited. So that's the interesting part to me, is there's a long tail on the exploitation of this, which means you need to be hitting something over and over and over again So from a defense perspective, maybe that creates some noise that we can key in on as defenders or from an alert standpoint. But that's the part that's interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, right? And so I mentioned that we see SSH a lot on these external pen tests, and we always write that up as a service that should not be exposed to the internet, right? And so our position on that is this: SSH is, effectively could be used as a management port. It just does not have the mechanisms integrated within it for proper defense. And so, what do I mean by that? Well, when we're exploiting SSH, we're usually brute forcing or credential stuffing, or we're guessing user account, stuff like that. We've never been caught doing it, right? And it's not because anybody's doing anything wrong. It's just that monitoring SSH activity is incredibly difficult. And so, it's not like M365 or, some of these other larger scale authentication components that have built-in logging that do a good job of sending those logs off to, a SIM or something like that. And so, because of those challenges, we recommend to clients to get that off the public internet, right? And if you have to have it on the public internet, go through the pains to monitor the logs associated with it, and that is really our number one recommendation here,
Yeah.
right? Other than upgrading to the latest version.
Yeah, I wish Darius was here, because I'd like to pick his brain about how often OpenSSH is like exploited in something like an OSCP, right? Because when you do your Nmap scan and you look at the ports, it's like port 53, and it's like, oh, it's probably a domain controller, but and then you look at the other host, it's like, oh, it's got OpenSSH, and like everything has OpenSSH on it seemingly when you do like hack the box or you do these pen test labs, but it's never the thing that gets exploited. And here we are in the real world. There's this remote code execution vulnerability in OpenSSH.
Yeah.
So now I feel like there's going to be a wave of hack the box machines and like labs that are going to be exploiting OpenSSH vulnerabilities because of this.
No, I completely agree. I do. It's wild, the contrast between like an exam like that and HTB and CTFs and stuff like that, and then you get out and you're actually doing the job in the real world. It's nothing like that at all. Like it's neat and there's value in it, so I don't want to take away from it. But so yeah, let's deep dive in this. And so, nerd alert, right? We're about to talk about some very specific, super detailed things, and so we're going to touch on it really just to kind of level set so everybody kind of understands what the terminology is, right? So the first thing I want to do is kind of read a little bit from Qualys with regards to what the exploit is and how it works. And so they discovered what's called a signal handler race condition. There are three completely unique things in that one phrase that we're going to break down and talk about. But the kind of nickel tour version of this is if a client does not properly authenticate within the grace period, which is 120 seconds by default, then a handler is called. But the problem is it is not async signal safe. Okay, so I'm going to explain what all that means. But the basic idea is a signal in C is a method by which standardized messages are sent to the program. So think about like when you have a program running and you want to interrupt it and you do it like a control C, that would be an example of where a signal would come into play. And what makes signals unique and the reason that race conditions occur within them is they very frequently support what's called an asynchronous action. An asynchronous action, by contrast to a synchronous action, is when we are operating or interacting with something, but we're not doing it in a two-way, like, hey, I'm going to create this memory space, and then I'm going to remove this memory space, right? So timing from an asynchronous function perspective is really critical when we start talking about this. And that's actually the reason the word race is used, right? That's what a race condition is when you get the timing off, and it allows you to do something you shouldn't be able to do. In this case, corrupt memory. And so now, you mentioned that there's a denial of service capability here. There is also, theoretically some remote code exploit opportunity here as well, which is very frequently the case when we start talking about things like race conditions. And so the way this whole thing happens is in the specific example that Qualys has is they're calling a syslog function. And a syslog function is going to occur outside of the memory space of the application, or it may occur in a different memory space, than is directly controlled by the application itself. And so that's where a potential overstep or out of bounds, or there's a lot of terminologies that we can use. But the idea here is we're calling syslog, and that signal is not synchronous, meaning that the application itself doesn't have control over the memory space, and so that's where the issue comes into play here, right? The bigger issue, kind of as we start, getting past that point, is this is occurring within the application, with full privileges, right? So there are components of the service that will run, and they'll be running with elevated privileges, and that's why an RCE in this condition would lead to potentially the entire system being compromised. Like you said, though, it's not as straightforward as like a normal, RCE, where you run the exploit code, it fires, boom, you get you might get a shell back or something like that. In this particular case, like you said, it takes, I think, what they say, 10,000 tries on average for this thing to fire. And that's running 10 connections with a 120-second grace period. So we are talking about a 1, 2, maybe even longer, depending on the speed and capability of the service and connection, to get that to fire. There are other conditions that reduce that time. So I've seen other, statements that say that it doesn't take that long on certain systems. The reason this is so huge, you mentioned that there's like millions and millions of these out there. They're embedded in a lot of things, right? OpenSSH is on IoT devices. It's frequently on things like firewalls. It's frequently on, other types of appliances. For example, it is the method by which you can administer VMware ESX, for example.
Yep. So you
So
can be on toasters, IoT devices, like you mentioned,
literally,
refrigerators,
yeah.
wireless equipment, and even embedded, like you mentioned, embedded controllers, even manufacturing devices.
Oh yeah, man.
When you start talking about manufacturing stuff, like this is very common. Cold refrigerators, like those cold refrigerators that have like medical equipment or like vials in them and stuff. Those have OpenSSH on them, right? So they can administer those appliances, the firmware side of things. So yeah, it's very much ubiquitous to technology.
Yeah, and that's kind of part of the challenge here, right? And why I think this is going to be a long-term problem for us going forward is because it's really hard to update a lot of those embedded devices, right? It's kind of the whole IoT problem is, you have this old code base that's written into the firmware. It's difficult to replace. In a lot of cases, manufacturers don't even provide that capability to upgrade the firmware.
And I got another crazy one for you. Those mechanical or those those big drilling rigs, a lot of those are controlled remotely. So like you send this big machine down to the mine, but it's dangerous down in the mine or the quarry or whatever. So they're remotely controlled, right? Those even can have OpenSSH on them. So imagine being able to hijack one of those, multi-million-dollar like machine rigging, oil digger machines, right?
Oh man, no doubt. And I want to say that there are some automobiles that leverage that for programming.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, just all kinds of stuff, man.
Yep.
And if I were employed in the industrial space, like what you're talking about, man, this would concern me greatly, and really anywhere, but specifically in anywhere there's a lot of embedded, firmwares and stuff like that. We've seen them on hospital beds.
Yep.
So pretty wild stuff. I will say, in the defense of the project OpenSSH, they run a tight ship over there, man. They do a really good job. They actually, so this was originally discovered, and when you look at the CVE, you're going to see that it's called a regression, right? A security regression. And so what that means is that they have reintroduced this vulnerability from a previous point in time. So this vulnerability was actually discovered in 2006. And so what ends up happening in a lot of cases, and you and I were kind of talking about this in the pre-show, in that, the code, it's really hard to get rid of that code. And so, they fixed it in the location that they originally found it in, and back in 2006, and then in 2020, so 14 years later, it was accidentally reintroduced into the code.
Mm.
And so, now here we are, 4 years later, it's been found, and there's apparently multiple instances. So we mentioned at the beginning that there's a CVE 2024-6409, which is basically the same thing in a different place in the code, right? And so another interesting aspect to this, though, and this is something we see all the time in this world, is that once somebody finds something serious, everybody's looking.
Yep.
So I would bet that there are going to be more that are going to be coming down the pike soon.
Yeah, you open a can of worms, and anybody that's worked in software, just been around it tangentially, knows like these regressions happen. Like these are things that happen all the time in software development and security testing. So much so that the entire industries have been built on it, right? Like pen testing. And application security testing, and all those products, those DAS and all those things, seek to eliminate those things, find those things and point them out, right? So you can eliminate them in your environments or your applications. So especially in large projects where there's a lot of lines of code in difficult languages, I'll call C a difficult language, like coming from somebody who knows programming and can code. Like C is a very difficult language.
Yeah.
It's not easy to just like whip stuff up and make sure that it's memory safe and it's secure and there's no issues or vulnerabilities. Like it's not an easy thing. And a lot of times it can be, somewhat, trivial just to introduce mistakes just out of, just not understanding the full code base, or trying to implement a new feature and kind of losing sight of some of the other things that have been fixed previously, or just any number of things. But this is by no means anything that the OpenSSH project did wrong. It's just it's part of software development and the difficulties of it. Fortunately, this was identified and found before any like major impact could happen. But like you said, it's still a developing story, so we maybe don't know the full breadth of this. But stuff like this are kind of the things that keep me up at night, kind of just knowing like what else is out there, like what are we missing? How can we identify those things sooner? How can we get to those things quicker, and that kind of stuff?
No, I completely agree. And, in C is challenging because they're really kind of broadly speaking, and I know there's probably some developer out there that's like rolling over when I say this, but you have native code, right? And that's what C would be considered. And so then you have interpreted code, things like Python, things like Ruby. And so, it's one of the reasons, and I'm not going to say that writing in an interpreted language is inherently more secure than writing in a native language, but it is harder, like you said, right? Because you have to, any type of security mechanism that you want to build into your program, you have to write. And it does open the doors for a lot of accidents and mistakes and things like that. And like you said, the larger the project is, man, you got 4 developers, even on a small project, can be writing things that are overlapping and impacting each other. And it really does create a lot of challenges. Fortunately, OpenSSH is very responsive. And so, those guys are going to be on top of it. One of the things that we should mention here too is there's not currently a public proof of concept, right? And that's good news. That buys us a little bit of time. However, there's some rumors out there that some APTs are already attacking this thing, right?
Yeah, so I was looking on Twitter and I saw that there were some posts indicating that there was some potential exploitation happening in the wild. I haven't looked at any of the sources or the IOCs specifically to confirm, but there's been a number of Twitter posts that kind of have shared IOCs. They've shared SHA-1 hashes. They've shared IP addresses. They've shared some information to suggest that there is some exploitation or attempts to exploit this, specifically the 2024 6387 version. And the one that I'm referencing right now, it says that the Go agent detected, which is used in the Chaos Rat project, apparently. And there's some batch script that's going around that's used in this regression exploit. And it supposedly is a script that downloads additional files and executes them. It changes permissions, it executes those files and into some other stuff. But that's specifically for the 6387 version. So I did find some IOCs, and I'll link that in the description. But interesting that this is kind of coming out now. There's some potential exploitation going on of this.
Yeah, and that looks like a Linux crypto mining project that the Chaos Rat project is linked to. There are some other potential APTs, but there's also great timing, by the way. But an article just came out on Info Security Magazine talking about specifically China and APT 40 is that they're literally turning these exploits over within hours. And so from the time that exploit code is discovered, created, whatever, especially, specifically when a POC is released, a public one, they're literally flipping that and leveraging it for nation state level action within hours, which is super quick, man. And it kind of illustrates the need for a more advanced vulnerability management program within an organization, right? This isn't something you want to wait on your annual pen test to go find and fix. This is something that you need to accelerate pretty dramatically.
Yeah, it's there's numerous reports like you mentioned. I think Mandiant, which is owned by Google now, I think had a recent report about some APT stuff using edge devices and stuff like that recently as well. That's a prime target, especially like you mentioned, this OpenSSH is on a lot of different things like Soho routers, right? Small home office routers.
Yeah.
It would not be out of the realm of possibility for a threat actor in China or Russia or something like that, non-US or non-Western country, to exploit something in a Western country where it's a little bit more trusted from a network traffic perspective, and use that as their pivot point, right? To kind of mask their location or their source of where those attacks are coming from. That is something that happens for sure. And I think, if you're a state actor outside of a Western country, I think it makes sense to target those things, to launch those attacks from, to mask your activity. So that's something to be mindful of as well, depending on your industry and geographically where your business is. It's something that's a key point to take note of from a threat intel perspective.
Yeah.
To kind of help inform your security strategy.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned threat intel, and that's a perfect segue into plugging. We actually have a threat intelligence newsletter. We'll link to that in the show notes. When this thing came out, an email went out shortly to the subscribers there, and basically it's just a free newsletter, and we go through every week and look at cyber news. We look, we're really focused more on vulnerabilities, proof of concept, exploits, stuff like that. And so it's just a way to kind of keep up to date on what's going on. And so it's a good aggregate source for cybersecurity news. So cool, man. So closing thoughts, any additional things you want to touch on with this?
No, it's super interesting from like a technology and security perspective, these kinds of things, especially the ones that don't just immediately blow up into like a big mess like Log4j or some of the other big ones, right? This is kind of a slow burn, right? Like it was it was announced, I think, July 1st, right? And it kind of hit the news and hit the Twitterverse and kind of made its rounds, and it was kind of quickly brushed off or dismissed as kind of not being super practical from an exploitability perspective. But I think it's interesting because of the fact that it's so ubiquitous. Like you said, OpenSSH is used in many, many, many different places. So that combined with the exploit probability and now showing evidence of potential exploit scripts and things like that is definitely one to be mindful of and interesting of. And then you add on to it that there's 900 million or whatever the total was. What was it? 90 million OpenSSH servers on the internet. That's kind of an interesting thing, and that's kind of where I see it, where I think it's the most interesting, and looking at it from a threat intel perspective, I think is interesting.
No, I totally agree. This is one of those few that is going to touch everybody, right? In one way or another. And um, you know, the exploit code is probably imminent, right?
Yep.
The details of this are known. The functions that are being called are in the paper published by Qualys.
Yep.
And it's an open source project, right? Which means you can go grab the source code and you can reverse engineer how this thing works relatively simply.
Yep.
Theoretically, I mean, I'm not going to do it, right? But I mean, it's
Yeah.
possible. But yeah. So I mean, I think POC
Yeah.
is imminent. So we'll see where this thing leads us. But it's definitely an interesting exercise in, like you said, threat intel, vulnerability management, all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's a good exercise in kind of staying up to date in your processes and your workflows of how you get news, how you validate it, how you prioritize. Using scenarios like this that don't immediately blow up is kind of a good dry run, I guess, for
Yeah.
when like the log4js happen. Because then you kind of have a process ironed out. You have a system, you have kind of a documented, plan of what you're going to do, where you get the information from, how you kind of tackle updating your systems, how you inventory those systems. So I really like using these situations as kind of like a dry run, a training session for those bigger events that are inevitably going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I see it too, kind of optimistically, like using it as a training guide or a training method for when those really big things hit the fan. So I think that could be really good to help people kind of drill that and train and process, improve your processes for that.
Yeah, I love it. This is an opportunity, not a problem.
That's right. Yeah, the optimist approach to vulnerabilities.
Nice. I love it. Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. If you like the stuff that we do, the best thing that you can do for us is like, subscribe, and most importantly, share it with your folks. And we'll see you